Okay, I'm going to talk about the fate of 4 wagers made by Lenin in 1917, and they are the wager on international revolution, on Soviet democracy, on steps towards socialism, and what I call peasant followership. I'll be explained. And first I'll look at them in 1917, then I'll show, this is about Lenin, not exactly the Bolsheviks, so about how Lenin felt they were turning out. And what happens is that in late 1918, early 1919, he's still very confident that most of them are paying off, but then he begins to realize that in several basic ways, not all, they're not paying off. And then I will go ahead to 1922-23, his last writings, where I think he achieves a shaky synthesis of sorts to look ahead. And I should say that the idea of a wager I'm using here is not to imply in any way adventurous or risky or whatever. It's just that when it comes from the Russian expression like in Stolypin that had a peasant policy, it was a wager on the strong. It's that idea. It was a wager you can have, when you have a policy, you are hoping that events will turn out in a certain way, you're making predictions. And since I'm not going to be talking about Kautsky very much in this talk, I'll start off with a Kautsky quote. Every politician who does not simply drift with events, this is back in 1904, every politician who did not simply drift with events but rather exerts a determining influence upon them must attempt to take stock of the probabilities and alternatives of the special course of the development of the nation in which he operates, and internationally. Nothing is more baleful than to sneer at every far-sighted policy, at each prediction, as the fanatics of present-day politics and exclusively routine work are so gladly doing today. The practical politician, if he wants to be successful, must attempt to see into the future just like the theoretical socialist. Whether this foresight assumes the form of a prophecy will depend on his temperament. But he must at the same time always be prepared for the appearance of unexpected factors, which will frustrate his plans and impart a new direction to development, and he must therefore be always ready to change his tactic accordingly. So that's sort of what how I'm approaching this, that Lenin is making predictions, and then when he sees that they're not working, he tries to deal with them. My source for all this, Lenin didn't write too much in the way, he didn't have time to write works. The Renegade Kautsky and Left-Wing Communism about the only book-length things that he produces. But I'm looking at his speeches, because that's what a big portion of what he did when he was in power, is he made speeches encouragement speeches, basically, to mainly party or sympathizing audiences, people who, come to Moscow for a conference or this or that other thing, or Red soldiers going off to the battles. And in those speeches, he would pound home, like a guy on the campaign stump, he'd hammer home the sort of the big message, the big story of what was happening. And I think that he was, sincere in what he was saying, so when he started to see things were changing, this was reflected in his speeches. And there's a sort of human drama in this, I think. You can sort of see it where sometimes his painful disappointment becomes right to the surface. A lot of this will be somewhat familiar. I'm not going to be a sort of revisionistic in this talk, but there is one familiar framework I am sort of politicizing against. This is not maybe the universal, but a lot of people, right and left, see the sort of events sort of in this broad way that in 1917, especially 1918, the regime starts off as sort of a moderate, realistic sort of way, going slowly, but then they get carried away during the Civil War, they get more and more radical. They were forced to be radical because of the Civil War, but they don't realize that's what's happening, so that by the time of 1920, they think they're on the leap to communism or shortcuts to communism, and they're sort of semi-insane, and then Kronstadt gives them a slap in the face, and they sort of say, thanks, I needed that, and we return to sober moderation of NEP. Okay, so that's a fairly common framework, and actually Lenin himself contributed to getting it installed. I see it in a different way. I see it in 1917 more unrealism and even demagoguery on Lenin's and Bolsheviks' part, and then a general sobering up so that in 1920 they're kind of glum and pessimistic. They're far from euphoric, as a word that's unbelievably assigned to them by many writers. So in 1920. So Arthur Ransome, the English writer, wrote, he was in Russia, he knew these Russian very well, he knew the top leaders and talked to them a lot, and he'd written two very good books you can dig up. They give the atmosphere of this time, Russia in 1919 and Russia in Crisis, that's Russian from 1920. Both are pre-NEP, so they're very valuable this way. And he has an expression which I like. He said, the Bolsheviks had illusion after illusion scraped from them by the pumice stone of experience. Kind of elaborate metaphor, but that's sort of what happened. And so the formula, a common formula that the over-theorization, I agree with that in a general way, that the Bolsheviks over-theorized and their own particular problems. But I think I have a somewhat different picture of what the theory was and so forth. Okay, 1917. Well, let's go back, let's ratchet back a little further than 1917, because the first real platform of what he was doing in 1917 really goes back to October 1915. It's a sort of a crucial document that's overlooked. It was sort of a little manifesto. Most of Lenin's writings in this period was about the European situation. This is one of the few that was really setting out programmatic for Russia. He says he wrote it in consultation with undergrounders from Russia. And it's sort of, how does he combine this left Zimmerwald message that I was talking about yesterday, international revolution and socialism in Europe, with events in Russia? How does he hook up his old desire for a revolution in Russia, a democratic revolution, with this? And as of October 1915, it's like this. The task of the proletariat in Russia is to carry out the bourgeois democratic Russian revolution in Russia to the end, and that's an old Bolshevik phrase, to the end, do konca, which is meaning the most thoroughgoing democratic revolution that is available. But it doesn't mean to go to socialism, it means to just get as much democratic gains as you can right at the beginning. In order, this is Lenin's emphasis, bring out the bourgeois democratic revolution in Russia in order to ignite the socialist revolution in Europe. So the Russian democratic revolution to carry out the socialist revolution in Europe. And then he sketches out a scenario that connects these two. An anti-Tsarist revolution, he says. Let's think of this an anti-Tsarist revolution. It brings to power revolutionary chauvinists, i.e. people who want to remove the Tsar just because he was bungling the war effort. Our slogan is against the chauvinists, even if they are revolutionaries and Republicans. The Bolsheviks, this is still I'm talking about, I'm not saying what happened, although you say it's a very good prediction. I'm talking about what Lenin wrote in October 1915. The Bolsheviks strive for a second stage of the revolution in which the proletariat assumes the leading role, supported by the petty bourgeois peasantry that has been pushed to the left by the burdens of war. The second stage of the revolution would resurrect the Soviets of 1905, acting as the heart of a new power that was lost. Then this revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry would resolutely carry out the whole of our minimum program and propose a just peace. The proposal would not really end the war. They didn't expect the imperialists would accept this proposal, but Russia would now be in a position to wage a just revolutionary war aimed at socialist revolution in Europe and around the world, anti-colonial revolutions around the world. And then he says, this is Lenin's words, there is no doubt that a victory of the proletariat in Russia would create extraordinarily favorable conditions for the development of revolution both in Asia and Europe. Even 1905 proved that. So what we see here is pretty much what he did, his platform in 1917. So I even said instead of talking about the April theses, we should talk about the October theses because they're already there. And Lenin himself said that because after the revolution happened, he wrote to friends saying, we predicted this in October 1915, and the program is that program, and we were absolutely right. However, there is one change, a very significant change, that he makes without too much fanfare right before he leaves for Russia. And that's what I call the addition of steps towards socialism. And that's the sort of careful way he's saying we're going to maybe have socialism here in Russia. But he always uses this metaphor. We'll move towards socialism. We're steps towards socialism. And that occurs just really on the eve of his removal back to the sealed train and everything. And I'm not going to go into. I have a theory about why that suddenly appears, but I'm not going to go into it because it's kind of detailed and speculative. And also, I think it calls a groan because, well, I'll just say the initials are K. Yes, that's right. Okay, so we'll skip over that. But in any event, that adds on now. It's sort of, for the first time, the possibility we have of Russia itself moving towards socialism. So not just a democratic revolution in Russia until there's a socialist revolution in Europe. Now Russia is going to be moving towards socialism regardless. It was very true what Mike said about his changing his views on smashing the state, but the phrase in this period, right in the beginning of 1917, but the phrase smashing the state can have a lot of meanings, and I'll get back to smashing the state a little bit later. In connection with Bukharin. Okay, so in 1917 he continued these three wages of October 15 plus the one new wager, and I just want to take a look at some of the arguments he made for this in 1917. State and Revolution, while it was written in 1917, was only published in 1918. And it really, we tend to overestimate its importance for the 1917 platform, I think. And you should, when you read it, you realize he's trying to be general. He can't help reverting every once in a while to the Russian situation, but it's addressed to a European audience, ideal audience. So the two books that I'm basically basing on, and I recommend for this, is the two other works that came out in September 1915. I'm not sure exactly when they published, but they were written then. The Impending Catastrophe and How to Deal with It, and Can the Bolsheviks Retain State Power? Those are the ones where he talks about Russia and has the platform and explains his logic. And so I sort of sum up the basic platform of 1914 as, right, 17, thank you, as take the power, addressed to the workers and peasants. And it's, no, he's not saying make a socialist revolution. He's saying workers and peasants, take the power, solve your problems. That's the message. And it's on the assumption that, as he says, the nature of the class that holds the vlast, I'm going to use the word vlasta probably a lot. It's the Russian word for it. It's usually translated power, but it also means authority, basic governmental core. The Bolshevism, the nature of the class that holds the vlast decides everything. Okay, and he meant everything. He meant everything because, in this context, because he sort of said the only reason, he said this over and over again, the only reason, and he meant it, that we're not carrying out measures that will solve the crisis is because of who's in power. The Bolsheviks told the Russian Narod that as long as the vlast was controlled by their enemies, the landowner, the capitalist, the bourgeois in whatever form, bourgeois is this Russian sort of insulting way of saying bourgeois, the imperialist war would continue, the economic collapse would continue, the postponement of radical land reform would continue. Troubles would cease only when the workers as a class took the power and fulfilled their historic mission of leading the whole Narod, the people, the peasants, to revolutionary victory. That's the overall message. So let's see how these four wages then are going. Well, the wager on international television, I'm not going to say too much about it. You're familiar, I mean, not because it's not important, but because I think you're familiar with it, I don't have much to say. Same with Soviet democracy, also very fundamental, but it's just, I'm not going to change your mind or have anything to say about that. But I do want to say some things about the other two. Steps towards socialism. First, aggressive, what Lenin's rhetoric in this period was sort of a new version of aggressive unoriginality, in that he said, listen, everybody knows what the answer is. Everybody knows what measures we should take. the Mensheviks write it, even the liberals, even the monarchists are aware that we need economic regulations, we need to have land reform, we need a strong power, governmental power, but they're afraid to do these things because of their class position. And so it's his outlook on this is summed up by a sort of chapter or section title in one of those pamphlets, I think, The Impending Catastrophe. Control measures are easy to take and known to all. So control meaning regulation and so forth. So, so that was the message. Control measures are easy to take and known to all. There's no ambiguity or difficulty in solving the crisis if you have the will. And the only way you have the will, of course, is to take power, the workers to take power. One of the logic here is partly what I call a Vumba for the people. Okay, what is Vumba? Sounds like some sort of pagan deity or something. No, it's a German acronym, and Tina, you can correct my pronunciation here, but it's Waffen- und Munitionsbeschaffungsamt. Is that good enough?
Waffen- und Munitionsbeschaffungsamt.
Okay. Sounds better than you said. And that was the weapons and supply bureaucracy in Germany, and that was sort of amazing everybody in those days at how organized it was and how the economy was working. And so Lenin, in 1916, was it, sort of said, he said, now he's talking about Europe here, he's talking about Europe. If, for instance, Germany can direct the economic life of 66 million people from a single center and strain the energies of the Narod to wage a predatory war in the interest of 100 or 200 financial magnates or aristocrats, the monarchy, etc., then the same can be done in the interest of 9/10 of the people, but the non-property masses, if their struggle isn't directed by the conscious or purposive workers, liberated from social imperialist and social pacifist influence. So his program for Europe was expropriate the banks and, relying on the masses, carry out in their interest the very same thing Vumba is carrying out in Germany. That's why I call it Vumba for the people. But now, could this be applied to Russia? Well, basically he answered yes. There was enough of an economic regulatory apparatus, there was enough of a banking system, there was enough of a governmental and trusts and so forth that you could do this. And so he said if we could do this, if we apply determined revolutionary democratic measures, we can solve the crisis. So I think there are 3 points I want to make about this wager, the wager on steps towards socialism. First, you know, we're talking about smashing the state and using the ready-made state. He says explicitly, we'll smash the state, i.e. the what he meant by that in the Marxist framework was the bureaucracy, the army, and the police, that is the repressive apparatus, the undemocratic apparatus. But we will preserve the economic apparatus, which a lot of that economic apparatus was what we would call the state. So, so he is saying at this point still that we're going to preserve what I would call the economic state apparatus. Also, I think when you read his rhetoric there and read both other Bolshevik rhetoric, they're promising an easy way out of the crisis. They are saying, if you elect us, comrades, we will get you out of this crisis pretty quickly and painlessly. So I think that there's a certain unrealism bordering on demagoguery here. And finally, Lenin is somewhat ambiguous about whether this is socialism or what exactly it is. For example, there's a circumlocution, like another section title, can we go forward if we fear to move towards socialism? So we're sort of moving forward and we're not afraid of socialism, but he's not quite saying it's going to be socialist. You know, it's slightly, as I said earlier, the heart of the message in 1917 was not create a socialist revolution. And that's actually, I have a feeling, rather downplayed in the rhetoric, but take over the power. Take over the power. Okay, so that's that. The steps towards socialism. To look ahead, basically what happened was that the the economic apparatus was smashed by events, and therefore, precisely because it was smashed, a repressive apparatus could not be smashed and had to be strengthened and reapplied. Okay, peasant followership. Well, what I mean by that is basically the old Bolshevik idea that you're going to rely on the peasants to follow you, you're going to try to be their leader. Now, the point I want to make, I use this word followership to say that leadership is like leadership, but it's not an insult, it's rather an exalted compliment. It's rather ambitious and optimistic about the capacities of the peasants to say, to make this wager on their followership. They have to understand their interests, they have to act in a sort of disciplined way. They're going to support. They're saying essentially, if we give their demands, their just demands about the land, they're going to support us against the counter-revolution. And when you look at the record of peasants in Western Europe, this was a gamble. This was a wager. And so that's one half of this wager. The peasant followership is the old Bolshevik one. We're going to complete the democratic revolution we've only had a half-assed democratic revolution here because we haven't destroyed class power, the gentry, we haven't satisfied land hunger. We're going to remove this class from history, the pomeshchik, the landowners, and we're going to get the peasants on board, and they will support us against the counter-revolution. This is sort of an old Bolshevism, somewhat readjusted, but basically old Bolshevism. But there's a new stage which is not so emphasized, and which this is kind of something I saw only when I sort of looked at the speeches and looked at offhand comments, really, and that is Lenin's hopes that actually the peasants would move toward socialism on their own. Now, and of course, if they did that, that would make really help the logic, the convincing, the persuasiveness of the case that moving toward socialism was possible in Russia alone. If the peasants started moving toward something like collectivized forms of production, then you would solve the problem. So, and I think so. This is an approach to the idea of socialism in Russia through a non-Trotskyite, non-Trotskyist, non-permanent revolution logic. Because Trotsky never said, in fact, the whole argument is premised on that the peasants would not be moving towards socialism on their own, whereas Lenin is now banking on this as a possibility. Sort of urged by the emergency of the war, urged by the facing a ruin, they will see that it's good to get together and good to cooperate with the state and so forth. Okay, those are the four wagers. Now we're going to jump ahead. I'm missing it. Can't tell the whole dramatic story here. But at the end of, let's go ahead 1 year to the end of 1918, and to the book The Renegade Kautsky and the Proletarian Power. Okay, I'm not going to look at anything what he says about Kautsky in that book. Half of it is abuse, and the other half is praise of the old Kautsky. Or maybe that's not a half, maybe it's a third or fifth or something. Anyway, but he does look over the accomplishments of the. This is like the anniversary, 1 year of the revolution, and he's looking back over and he's taking accounts as against Kautsky's criticisms. So, what is he saying here? Soviet democracy, that's fine. We're going along great there. I'll read what he says. In Russia, the bureaucratic machine has been completely smashed, razed to the ground. The old judges have been sent packing. The bourgeois parliament has been dispersed, and far more accessible representation has been given to the workers and the peasants. Their Soviets have replaced the bureaucrats, or their Soviets have been put in control of the bureaucrats, and their Soviets have been authorized to elect the judges. This fact alone is enough for all the oppressed classes in the world to recognize that the Soviet Vlast, that is, the present form of the dictatorship of the proletariat, is 1,000,000 times more democratic than the most democratic bourgeois republic. So at this point, he is still defiantly saying that there's no, it's completely democratic, unambiguously democratic. The peasant question. He says, rather strikingly, things have turned out just as we said they would. The course taken by the revolution has confirmed the correctness of our reasoning. And first of all, the Bolsheviks gained the loyalty of the whole peasants by supporting their desire for land. So that's the old Bolshevik part of it. We carried the bourgeois revolution to its end,到конца. Then he made the argument, we tend to forget about this argument that he made because it didn't pan out. He says the next phase, the step towards socialism phase, is in 1918. The peasants themselves will see the inadequacy of bourgeois democratic solutions and the necessity of proceeding beyond their limits, of passing on to socialism. Then he has a thing here about Kautsky himself said this in a book in 1899. All that Kautsky the Marxist wrote in 1899 in his agrarian question about the means at the disposal of the proletarian state for bringing about the gradual transition of the small peasants to socialism has been forgotten by Kautsky the renegade in 1918. So what he's hoping here is that the peasants will be moving to socialism. And he was sort of encouraged by a policy called class war in the villages that was going on then, although even as he was writing it, it was being pulled back. Okay, on the economy, he's defensive. That's the one place where he's a little defensive. The reason, obviously, being that the crisis had not gotten any better because of the Bolshevik Revolution, but had spiraled further into crisis. So he says, all the flunkies of the bourgeoisie in Russia argue in this way. Show us after 9 months your general well-being. And this, after 4 years of devastating war, with foreign capital giving all-round support to the sabotage and rebellions of the bourgeoisie in Russia. So, he's absolutely right. That's the basic reason, one of the basic reasons that it had the crisis. But he perhaps should have seen that in 1917. Other people did. Okay, the fourth one is the International Revolution, and this is November 1918. He's absolutely for it because the German Revolution just broke out, and Alexander Rabinowicz's new book ends at the end of this anniversary with the sort of celebrations of the anniversary, saying the revolution is on the march in Germany. And here I want to read something by Zinoviev said in September 1918. It was sort of a tribute to Lenin after he was shot. So one of the German Social Democratic moderate SDP people was Philip Scheidemann. Yeah. So Zinoviev said, Scheidemann knows that if he ends up hanging from a lamppost, and I'll bet that he does, that to a large degree Comrade Lenin will be to blame. We comrades will live to see the moment when our proletariat, through its Vozhd leader, Lenin, will dictate its will to all of old Europe. When Comrade Lenin will conclude treaties with the government of Karl Liebknecht, and when the same Lenin will help the German workers compose Germany's first socialist decrees. And Lenin himself ended the renegade Kautsky by saying, at the last page, the above lines were written on 9 November 1918. The same night, news was received from Germany, announcing the beginning of a victorious revolution, first in Kiel and other northern towns and ports, where the power has passed into the hands of the Soviets, then in Berlin. The conclusion which still remained to be written on my pamphlet on Kautsky and the proletariat revolution is now superfluous. Well, sadly enough, that's okay, so now I'm going to go into the phase of where Lenin has to sort of begin to acknowledge that things are going right, although I want to stress it, I don't see any fundamental change. It's just some very disappointing empirical realities that he has to handle. Well, in international revolution, the euphoria continues up to about early summer 1919, and I think here euphoria is about the right word. You know, in Krupska's memoirs, she says he was happier than she'd ever seen him practically in October, November 1918, and that's what other people. Ransom said after an interview with him in early 1919, he seemed to be like a happy man. I get that impression from his speeches because he thought it was paying off. He thought things were going okay. And so he says, I got to get my pages here. He says, he tells his audiences who are suffering through a lot of economic difficulties, he says, this is the last difficult half year because the international situation has never been so good. So he's going out, again, this is a wager, he's going out and telling his audiences, within 6 months, we're going to be over economic difficulties because we won't be blockaded and the international revolution will bail us out. Then in March 1919, the Hungary Revolution broke out, and this is a very indicative reaction by Lenin. He says he's especially chuffed by the revolution in Hungary because, as a more cultured country than Russia, Hungary would show the socialist revolution in a better light. This is his words. Without the violence, without the bloodshed that was forced upon us by the Kerenskys and the imperialists. So even here we see a real, that's from the heart, a real weariness about the kind of things he ended up having to do. And there's some very eloquent things here. He says, the earlier generations of Russian revolutionaries, they lived and they died. We are in a happier place. We're going to see the triumph. We're going to see it happen. No matter how much great misfortunes that may be brought upon us by that dying beast, international imperialism, that beast will perish and socialism will triumph throughout the world. And here's the most amazing one. We say, this is July 1919, we say with confidence, taking all our experience, all that has happened this past year into account, that we shall surmount all difficulties, and that this July will be the last difficult July, and that next July we shall welcome the victory of the World Soviet Republic. And that victory will be full and complete. Whoa, and that's in a public speech. So he's really putting himself out on a limb there. Okay, so what happens is that that kind of rhetoric comes to a sudden halt in about August with the defeat of the Hungarian Revolution and never really comes back. I've looked through his speeches in 1919, and the same message is all through the year except on International Revolution, where he's happy and confident in the first half and not so happy and confident in the second half. So, and by 1920, I mean, I'm not going to go much into this because I think you're kind of familiar with it, but one contrast is in an interview with Arthur Ransome in 1919, he confidently predicts a revolution in England. And when Arthur Ransome said, well, I don't know, he sort of said, well, I'll tell you, I once had typhoid when in the 1890s. I once had typhoid, abortive typhoid, but I had it for a long time before I knew it. And so I was walking around, and then I was struck down. And that's what England is. It's got the disease. It's walking around, but it's going to collapse. And Ransome sort of said to himself, "Yes, abortive typhoid. It didn't really happen to you." A year later, he has an interview with Bertrand Russell, who's also there. His book is worth reading. His visit to Russia in 1920, and already he's given up on this revolution in England. And at this point, I think the Bolsheviks said they were no longer in a revolutionary situation. That is, the basic idea that we talked about yesterday, 1914, we're now in a revolutionary situation. They're sort of out of it now. Zinoviev says, at the second Congress of the Comintern, really, even though they have a brave front, they're really sort of telling the other parties, as opposed to the first one, that we're not in a revolutionary situation. So Zinoviev said, for example, revolutionary Soviets make sense only in a revolutionary situation, since, quote, Soviets without proletarian revolution must inevitably turn into a parody of Soviets. So, quote, so in the next historical period, political life in Europe will unfold. In the next historical period, we'll have Soviets, but right now, only propaganda about them was appropriate. So there you are. You sort of we're back to a non-revolutionary situation, which leads to the following dilemma. You've developed a new party model over the years, based on the premise of being in a revolutionary situation. So all sorts of things are appropriate to that. There's a certain amount of purging of opportunists, the discipline, the underground, certain other things were argued for on the basis of being a revolutionary situation. And now you're out of it, and what party model are you going to suggest now? And that's a sort of dilemma, because I just think that may be one of the reasons for the over-theorization problem that we've talked about, that they never really did solve that problem. Okay, so the Polish War in 1920, when they tried to ignite, that was a brief reigniting of the hopes that maybe sort of desperate hopes that we could get the international revolution going, but it came and went very fast. That's the big thing about the Polish War. You had no idea they were going to do something like that. Then the opportunity came. They tried to grab it. They were pushed back in 6 weeks, whatever it was, and they forgot about it. So, starting from about mid-1919, more and more the foreign policy is more and more oriented on treaties, on economic concessions, on trade treaties, on recognition, and that's not revolutionary. Of course, they never give up on that. Wager on Soviet democracy. The big point I want to make here is that they were aware, they acknowledged, it was open that things weren't turning out so well. And in 1920, there was a debate at the end of the year in the party about all these things, about elitism and lack of democracy, and it was called the hires versus the lowers, the hierarchy versus the nizi, the sort of people on top and the party people below. And so it was a fairly wide-ranging critique and debate. And what's interesting to me is what the leaders on top, the people like Zinoviev, whom I'm going to quote here, who was sort of the point man to go out and answer this, how much he admitted that we're willing to admit how bad things were. So this is Zinoviev, and he's been, this is of course the official Politburo Bureau, he's a spokesman, so it's not Zinoviev. Okay, the wager on the Soviets, quote, as organs, the 1917 wager on the Soviets, as organs in which the creativity of the masses finds for itself the most free and most organized path. The Soviets as organs that guarantee a constant stream of fresh forces from below. The Soviets as organs where the masses learn at one and the same time to legislate and carry out their own laws. This is not paying off at present. The most elementary demands of democratism are being ignored. So he wants to give the excuses for this. He says, but, how can we do, comrades? The pressures of administering the state, the necessity to put these are all his ways of saying, the necessity to put extreme pressure on the population because of the Civil War, the centralized discipline imposed by wartime necessities, the need often to side with bourgeois specialists against the workers to get the factories, keep the factories going, and the overload on working responsibility placed on a thin party elite. Now, listen to this now. Zinoviev warned the party that despite the validity of these excuses, it ran a real risk of degeneration into a stratum, quote, of state-employed intellectuals, Soviet chinovniki, that's a Russian contemptuous word for bureaucrats, Soviet and party bureaucrats that would, quote, fence itself off from the masses with a wall. So, pretty good for 1920. And that's an official statement. Okay, so in some sense, the wager on Soviet democracy was not paying off, but in one fundamental sense, of course, it did pay off. And that fundamental sense was this was a worker blast. This was a worker peasant blast, and the opposite side was not. It was a bourgeois gentry, especially a gentry landowner blast, and therefore the Civil War was, in some sense, it's almost impossible to imagine that the whites could have won because their class interests clashed so much with the people's class interests. And I like a little Lenin was saying to some Bolsheviks. In the summer of 1919, Lenin's lieutenant Kalinin, he later on became sort of a Stalinist ball almost, gave an agitational speech in Saratov near the front lines of the struggle against the white general, Denikin. Lenin told his audience he wasn't worried that much about he's sort of almost in the trenches here. As soon as Denikin came close to Saratov, all of a sudden everybody became a genuine supporter of Soviet power. No one was deserting. And then he says, this is Lenin's words, no Cheka operation could purge the area of opposition elements as thoroughly as just the approach of Denikin's soldiers. That the crisis is going to accelerate, even though the first step of the solution is to get the worker power. They're the only constructive force. But the crisis is going to accelerate sometime before they get back. There's going to be a period of what he elegantly calls expanded negative reproduction, which means a collapse, and then only later can we really start going. So that's his understanding of smashing the state. You have to smash not only the political but the economic and the military and everything else. You have to accept that it's going to break apart, and that's going to be a tragic breakdown for society, and then only slowly be put back together. And real progress to socialism is only possible when it has been put back together, which hadn't happened by 1920, but it's justified. All that the Bolsheviks had done were justified, the coercion and the militarization, because in the long run this was necessary to put worker power, and worker power was necessary to get socialism. And he has a nice phrase there which Lenin liked. Lenin read it and had lots of marginal notes. He says, all we have so far is, quote, social disintegration and a crude sketch of the future. Okay, I'm sort of running out of time. There's really something important I wanted to say about peasants. Okay, I'll say that, and maybe I'll skip the Testament part, the 1922 part. No? Okay, good. Okay, I'll get to the end of the story. Okay. This is something that about the peasant followership business that I discovered just by reading the speeches, and I think this is kind of a new discovery because I don't know anyone who's pointed this out. And let me just say that there's also even a feeling that a lot of people say, well, there's the two Lenins. So hard about Lenin and the peasants. There's the hardline Lenin of 1919, and there's the sort of good Lenin of the Lenin of 1921-22, the NEP. And that Stalin reverted back to the bad Lenin of 1919, the hardline Lenin. So that's one, but actually, you see the plausibility comes from the fact that they were putting extreme pressure on the peasants to take bread and grain and soldiers for the army, and that there are a lot of peasants' rebellions and so forth. So it has a certain surface plausibility. But we're not talking about the fact that they had to put pressure, like they're also doing on the workers and everybody else. We're talking about the change in peasant production. The sort of thing that this is what we want to talk about. If we want to compare what happened in 1919-20 with Stalin's collectivization. It's a change in your whole mode of production. It's a change in, therefore, your whole way of life. Okay, for starters, as I said, Lenin wanted to hope that the peasants would move forward on their own toward first two possible ways of collective production. Not collective farms, which is minor during this period, but state farms, or sovkhozy, that you would take an estate, and a previous landowner estate, and there's a big large-scale framework enterprise, and the peasants would come and work it. And that's one, the state farms. And the other one was communes, and that's again for a very small scale, but very intense. Usually, poor peasants would get together in the communes and in a commune and really share everything, not only production but everything. And as one Russian observer, emigre, non-Marxist, observed rather dryly and accurately, the Bolsheviks made attempts to produce new agrarian forms, but they did not expect any great success out of them, and did not achieve any success. And that's how it came. It was there was the range from pathetic. Well, Lenin put great hopes on this for reasons I mentioned. This was going to be, especially when the International Revolution was not fulfilling itself. So he was devastated by this. And you can mark his reaction in speeches from the late 1918 to 1921, where he gets more and more exasperated, more and more. These communes are worthless. This is 1919. The peasants say, "Long live the Soviet power, long live the Bolsheviks, but down with the communia." So communes sound like communists, so that's a problem, right? They cursed the communia when it was organized in a stupid way and forced upon them. They are suspicious of everything that's imposed upon them, and quite rightly so. We must go to the peasants, we must help them, teach them, but only in the field of science and socialism. In the area of farm management, we must learn from them. So he's sort of taking the side of the peasants who don't like the communes and the state farms. And okay, lots of quotes here about how awful, how ridiculous these things are, that they're an embarrassment, that the peasants around laugh at them, and rightly so. So that's one. So it's not working. The voluntary thing is not working. So what's his reaction? One reaction might be, well, then let's get them in by force, and that's more or less what Stalin's reaction was in 1931, right? So you know, we're going to have this. We're going to get people collectivized, and if they don't smart enough to see the advantages, we'll get them in there, and then they'll see. But no other time except in exactly 1919 is Lenin so eloquent and explicit about the fact that violence is absolutely verboten when we're talking about changing collective form, changing mode of production. He said the communists would never resort to violence. The absurdity of this, Lenin's words, the absurdity of this is so obvious that the Soviet government long ago forbade it, so that the last trace of this outrage, безобразие, would be swept from the face of the Soviet Republic. And he has, I can come up with a lot of things like that. It's just that no Marxist would ever condone violence and force in getting peasants into changing the mode of production. And this was remembered by dissident Bolsheviks when the collectivization time came. So, on the question of was Lenin was his policies toward the peasants a forerunner of Stalin? I think he can give an unambiguous answer: no. He denounced it ahead of time. Okay, I'm going to zip ahead now to his final. Oh, I got to say that so there he was. That's one reason he was so excited about electrification. Electrification, he sort of discovered that as a possible project and plan in late 1920, and or was it early 1920? Anyway, on there, and he grabbed it because that was how he was going to get the peasants to socialism. He was going to electrify the countryside. Okay, so now in his final writings, I'll just be as brief as I can about what he's saying in 1922-23 about the final thing. International revolution. He has what I call a holdout perspective. If the Soviet Revolution can hold out especially until the Asian and the world, the Chinese and so forth, kick in. And he uses this word in his final article, Better, Fewer, but Better. He uses words like hold out or very similar words about 6 or 7 times. I counted them in 2 or 3 pages. Soviet power. Okay, there's a very sad kind of irony here in that the word Soviet, first it meant the councils, right? But by 1920 it began to mean the government, as opposed to the party or the people. Or the Soviet was the government. So get the Soviets to do this means get the bureaucracy to do it. Well, the bureaucracy and the bureaucrats were bourgeois, spiazzi, and czars, holdovers, and people you were suspicious of. So gradually, in the vocabulary of many of the top Bolsheviks anyway, the word Soviet got to mean a rather very negative ring. You know, the Soviet bureaucrat, the Soviet. I saw this in Stalin's letters. You know, from the mid-20s. It took me a while to figure this out. Why was Soviet such a negative word? It's because it got to mean the government. So that's sort of in some ways the ironic end of the Soviet, not the end of it, but the result of it. So what Lenin in the 22-23 tried to do is come up with a scheme whereby you would remake Soviets from above by using the party, but you would also bring in workers and peasants, not from below, but sort of siphoned off to the top and help remake it. And that was his workers and peasants inspection idea, on which he spent a lot of thought and time in his last articles. Peasant followership. It's now the switchka, the link, the familiar we have to lead the peasants to socialism and make sure that the kulaks and the new bourgeoisie do not lead them in their direction. The famous phrase "who whom," people, you know this phrase "who whom katokovo," etc. Yeah, it's famous for supposed to being Lenin's favorite phrase. No, he only used it 2 or 3 times at the very end of his, and he hardly mentioned it. Zinoviev and others picked up on it. That's the only reason we know this phrase. And what he meant by it was that the peasants will either follow us or they'll follow the bourgeoisie. It's old Bolshevism transformed into the new situation. So we're going to revise. We're going to remake the peasantry via electrification and keep them on our side in the meantime. That's the plan. Okay, steps towards socialism. Again, things weren't great in 1921. They sort of clambering out of the crisis, but they really were not yet. And there was a huge famine, as you know, in 1921-22. So here's what he says about that. He's so angry that the advantages of socialism, the attractiveness of socialism, was not able to reveal itself. So this is from one of the last articles. The West European capitalist powers failed to overthrow the new system created by the revolution, but they did prevent it from at once taking the step forward that would have justified the forecasts of the socialists, that would have enabled the latter to develop the productive forces with enormous speed, to develop all the potentialities which, taken together, have produced socialism. Socialists who would thus have proved to all and sundry that socialism contains within itself gigantic forces, and that mankind had now entered into a new stage of development of extraordinarily brilliant prospects. So you can see from that Lenin still very much believed in socialism, but felt that he couldn't, that the international situation, particularly the intervention, had prevented it from coming. In one of his very last articles, it's called "Our Revolution," he said something like, he made a really significant admission, and maybe the most significant change right at the very end, and I'm not even sure that he meant this article as he published it. He said, he sort of admits that the socialists who criticized the Bolsheviks for saying, by saying Russia was not right for socialism, that they were right. But he says, we had to do what we did because they were facing an emergency, a life and death emergency. But he says, why not? Why isn't it possible for us to, once we get in power, to create the culture possible, the cultura, the culture that cultural prerequisites for socialism that we lacked? So that's I think, a fairly substantial change in Marxism. Okay, I'm going to just read out what I think his final synthesis was on the wages. Hopes have faded for the socialist revolution in Europe any time in the foreseeable future? Then take courage from the inevitable awakening of the East while praying that inter-capitalist squabbles will allow socialist Russia to hold out. Hopes have faded that Soviet-style democracy from below will transform the state? Then use the party to remake the inherited state apparatus from above. Hopes have faded that the peasants would move towards socialist transformation on their own initiative? Then take the old Bolshevik scenario of class leadership that had vindicated itself during the Civil War and apply it to the novel task of overcoming the market by using the market. That was the NEP strategy. Hopes have faded that the measures required to solve Russia's economic crisis will also be at the same time steps towards socialism, because the NEP especially, they had to solve their crisis by very non-socialist measures. Then build up industry to the point where Russia can move ahead to socialism, and this is Lenin's imagery, not at the slow pace of a peasant nag, but at the high speed of advanced industrial technology. Do all these faded hopes mean that our socialist critics were right and that Russia was not ready for socialism? Yes, but who's to say that a proletarian Vlast cannot pull itself up by its own bootstraps by itself creating the cultural prerequisites for socialism?